Good evening. My name is Dr. K. Wise Whitehead, and I'm the newly elected president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH. In 1926, Dr. Carter G. Woodson initiated the celebration of Negro History Week, which corresponded with the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. In 1976, this celebration was expanded to include the entire month of February. And today, Black History Month garners support throughout the country as people of all ethnic and social backgrounds join an ongoing conversation about Black history. ASALH views the promotion of Black History Month as one of the most important components of advancing Dr. Woodson's legacy. When Dr. Woodson first established Negro History Week, he realized the importance of providing a theme to focus the attention of the public. We have continued in that tradition. The 2025 Black History Month theme, African Americans and Labor, focuses on the profound ways that work and working of all kinds, free and unfree, skilled and unskilled, vocational and voluntary, intersect with the collective experiences of Black people. As we note in our executive summary, this work is at the very center of much of Black history and culture. Our work to build and sustain this country has been transformational throughout the Americas, Africa, and the diaspora. Our theme seeks to highlight and celebrate the impact and the importance of this work. Now, when I think of labor, I think of Sister Fannie Lou Hamer, activist and vice chair of the 1964 Freedom Democratic Party, who once said in a speech when she was asked about how long it takes for things to change in America, she said, it takes time. For 300 years, we've given them time, and I've been tired so long. Now I am sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we want to change. We want to change in this society in America because, you see, we can no longer ignore the facts and getting our children to sing, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed." What do we have to hail here? The truth is the only thing going to free us. See, here at ASALH, we stand on the truth. We stand on Dr. Woodson's legacy, and we stand on our belief that Black history is American history. Now is the time. And we invite you to stand with us as we celebrate Black History Month. Welcome to ASALH.
Good evening, everybody. It is my pleasure to bring the blessing for our Black History Month Festival. Will you join me? Spirit of the eternal God, known by many names and stripes, we ask you for your blessings and presence for the Association of African American Life and History, ASALH, and the Black History Month Festival. Your divine breath and creative power compel this organization and its members to stand against injustice, oppression, and miseducation. You enable light to shine in dark places as ASALH educates, researches, preserves, and empowers people in a reservoir of truth, strength, pride, and hope. Rise as a legacy to the descendants of the African diaspora and the lived culture of Black life. The voices of griots and the sounds of the drums echoed in the spirits in the dungeons of the slave castles, among the enslaved in hulls of the slave ships, despite the dying and stench of death, in the secret whispers crossing the seas and throughout the plantations. Teachers shaped their minds and inspired their potential in a society that marginalized them so that they would know the fertility of greatness. Families told stories that lived at family reunions and around the dinner tables. Preachers, African priests and priestesses, forged courage and faith through the rich infusion of African spirituality. The richness and heritage of the motherland unapologetically told her story in traditions, cultures, cooking, dancing, music, art, drumming, braids, natural hairstyle, and patterns in fabrics. We thank you, God, for resistance, grace, and liberation theology. Thank you for our scholars, John Hope Franklin, Vincent Hardin, Henry Louis Gates, James Weldon Johnson, John Bracy, and unsung lay historians. For our writers and poets, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Amanda Gorman, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and August Wilson. For our activists, Martin Luther King Jr., Bryan Stevenson, John Lewis, Marion Frances Berry, Angela Davis, Latifah Simon, Tiara Taylor, Nelson Mandela, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Malcolm X. For our spiritual leaders, Richard Allen, Desmond Tutu, Prathia Hall Bracey, George Lyle, Jarena Lee, Vashti McKenzie, and William Barber. Our strength reflects the hand of God throughout our struggles to survive and affirms our dignity and human right to reclaim our freedoms and to heal from trauma of racism, oppression, and injustice, including spiritual and physical abuses to our bodies. We thank you, Almighty God, for countless blessings in scholarship in every field, Black History Month luncheons, annual conferences, publications, and every opportunity you open a doorway for Asala to be known by the tireless efforts of the Asala family to carry on the mission and vision of our founder, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and the work of branches in America and internationally every day. Ashe.
Negro National Anthem, lift every voice and sing.
Every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Every voice and sing, let our rejoicing rise, high as the listening skies, let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Every voice and sing a song, full of the faith that the darkness has taught us. Sing a song, full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on, till victory is won.
moved to, yeah, I know. He moved to New York City in 1911. After reading W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks, he decided to devote his life to fighting for African-American equality. In 1914, Brother Randolph married Lucille E. Green, a Howard University graduate and entrepreneur whose economic support allowed Randolph to pursue civil rights full-time. She is an unsung hero. In June 1925, a group of Pullman porters and all Black service staff of the Pullman Sleeping Car Company approached Brother Randolph and asked him to lead the new organization, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Brother Randolph agreed, and in 1925, he fully established the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. The Pullman Company was the largest single employer of African Americans in the nation at the time. Many of the 10,000 Pullman porters were college graduates and highly respected in their own communities. Yet on the job, they were subjected to low wages, disrespectful treatment, and the discriminatory practices. Brother Randolph led them for 10 years, ultimately receiving recognition from the Pullman Car Company in 1935, as well as nearly $2 million in increased wages, a shorter work week, and overtime pay. So essentially, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became the nation's first officially recognized Black labor union. He continued the struggles for economic equity during the 1930s by serving as the president of the National Negro Congress. Brother Randolph became a widely known spokesman for African-American working class interests in the country. In December of 1940, with President Roosevelt refusing to issue an executive order banning discrimination against Black workers in the defense industry, Brother Randolph called for, in the words of James Farmer, 10,000 loyal Negro American citizens to march on Washington, D.C. Support grew quickly that soon that he was calling for 100,000 marchers to converge on the Capitol. Pressed to take action, President Roosevelt issued an executive order on June 25th, 1941, 6 days before the march was to occur, declaring that there should be no discrimination in employment of workers in the defense industry or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. After the passage of the Selective Service Act in 1947, Brother Randolph demanded that the government integrate the armed forces. After this morning, there was a fantastic panel celebrating the anniversary of the desegregation order. And one of the issues that came out is why don't we talk about what Truman gets a lot of press regarding his policies of ending segregation in armed services, but I think we tend to neglect just the impact that Randolph's call and demands for this back when he was making claims for the 1941 March on Washington. That one of the things he advocated for was allowing Black men to serve in an integrated service. He founded the League for Nonviolent Civil Disobedience Against Military Segregation and urged young men, both Black and white, to refuse to cooperate with the Jim Crow conscription service, threatened a widespread civil disobedience and needing the Black vote. In his 1948 re-election campaign, President Truman signed an executive order in January 26, 1948, ending discrimination, quote, as quickly as possible. Brother Randolph is credited with being an architect of the 1963 March on Washington as well. This march offered Martin Luther King Jr. a forum for his famous I Have a Dream speech and is credited with creating the momentum that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Brother Randolph continued to advocate for political and economic equality throughout his life. He was one of the founders of the Negro American Labor Council and served as president from 1960 to 1966. In 1964, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Lyndon Johnson. 1968, he was named the president of the recently formed A. Phillip Randolph Institute, which was established by the AFL-CIO to promote trade unionism in the Black community. He would continue to serve on the AFL-CIO executive board until 1974, which was extremely controversial because during the mid-1930s, so many Black-led unions that were affiliated with the American Federation of Labor left to join the burgeoning upstart organization called the Congress of Industrial Organization, which provided greater protections and access to union rights and benefits than the stalwart AFL. And Randolph would constantly receive criticism by Black unionists. And one of the things that he truly believed was that in order to fight discrimination within the House of Labor, he needed to stay there and continue to impress on that fight. And I think as I look around, Cornelius Bynum, my good friend and brother and colleague over there at Purdue, he's one of the experts on Randolph in the nation. I think his work really frames this much better than I could in just such a brief period of time. Brother Randolph continued to advocate for political and economic equalities throughout his life. Unmet set apart. Randolph was a member of Iota Sigma chapter, Phi Beta Sigma, and crossed in Richmond, Virginia, somewhere in the 1930s. I believe I saw a document that said around 1933, but maybe some of the brothers up here can enlighten me on that one. He was a socialist, ran for president as a socialist candidate, organized union elevator workers in 1917 in New York City, and became president of the National Brotherhood of Workers in 1919. His career spans so many important events in Black labor history. But I think what I want to talk about very briefly is my work largely revolves around Black Chicago. I've been studying the period. I was born and raised in Chicago, and my family came to Chicago in 1905, in the years traditionally outside of the traditional Great Migration to the city. So I tell the story when my grandparents talk about down home. We don't have conversations about Mississippi or Louisiana or Arkansas or Memphis. We talk about Chicago, and largely we talk about Bronzeville. We talk about 39th Street. We talk about, and some people call it the low end, but the traditional Black community of Chicago. And one of the things that happens there is when Randolph was organizing the Brotherhood, there are a number of stories about he would travel oftentimes on a shoestring budget between Chicago, New York, and other places just to talk to the porters. And there was one individual who was very important in the story. And this is another porter who was not a Sigma, but his name was Milton Webster. And Milton Webster was a domineering figure in the Brotherhood. And the story goes that Phillip Randolph traveled to Chicago, and if he was able to win the support of Milton Webster, then he would win the larger support of the rank and file within the Brotherhood Sigma Pi porters. And I think it's important to note that Chicago as a hub in which Randolph was operating in, Chicago was the headquarters of the Pullman Company. Pullman having come to Chicago in the 1870s to help rebuild the city after the Chicago fire. And the story is quite famous. He came there as a young hydraulics engineer, took the train from out east to Chicago, and started to draw up plans on the Pullman Palace cars, these opulent train cars. And one of the things that he wanted to do, he wanted white people to feel like they were riding in the most luxurious transportation mode in the country. So he decked these train cars out and he rented them to the railroad companies. But one of the things that Pullman did, which is both nefarious, but also I think extremely important for the larger trajectory of Black labor history and developing the Black middle class, is that he hired ex-bonds people, ex-enslaved people, right, to work as porters, butlers on these trains to make white people feel that they had this consistent serving class working at and available at their beck and call. Now, on the surface, I think that some people would judge this effort by Pullman as being overtly racist. You may have a point. However, if we think about Black workers' agency, right, these Black men were afforded opportunities not openly available for African Americans at this time. These individuals were able to travel the country. They weren't regulated to working in the steel mills or the docks or the lumber fields or in the coal fields or in agriculture. They were able to wear uniforms. They were able to work for tips. Mind you, they were working 60, 70, 80 hours, overworked, underpaid, but in their community, they were something special, right? Being a porter opened the doors into the middle class. I think it's sort of akin to what people saw the post office in the 1930s and 40s. This was something that afforded African Americans salaries and opportunities heretofore not known to them. So when Randolph is organizing the porters and when he goes there to get the support of people like Webster. He goes and I was talking to my brother Omar over there the other day, is I live in Bronzeville now. I lived in Bronzeville about 22 and a half years, and I do tours of Black Chicago. And there's one church, the Metropolitan Baptist Church, which was a location. They were constantly host A. Phillip Randolph when he came to Chicago and did his organizing, and the church is up for sale now. And I think that my chapter, our fraternity house, we have the only fraternity house and the oldest fraternity house in the Great Lakes region, the Great Lakes region. And our chapter was home to a number of dignitaries such as Harold Washington, the first Black mayor of Chicago, the most segregated city probably in the world, was a member of my chapter. He was made as mayor. Arthur Works Mitchell, the country's first Black Democratic congressman, was was actually president of my chapter. We have one of the first Black Illinois Supreme Court justices is a member of my chapter, along with a number of Congress people, state legislature, who are all members of my chapter. So it's a very important chapter. And I think what's important was that Brother Randolph is organizing in this Black community down the street from the fraternity house, right? So there's these conversations that are going on with the brothers, the Sigma brothers there, but also informing his work in Chicago. But the church is for sale now. So I think that there are these opportunities for us to, and I don't want to go over to Omar's conversation about how we frame these sites, but I think there are these opportunities for us to, especially in Chicago, to talk about Randolph and really what he meant, and Chicago's important role played in the Black freedom struggle of the 20th century. And interestingly enough, I think this church also is important in the story of Chicago, civil rights, and Randolph, because when he declared, so there's a thing about the March on Washington movement, right? So the story goes that A. Phillip Randolph, Walter White, who was head of the NAACP, they get this meeting with Franklin Roosevelt. And Randolph makes this threat, which Roosevelt wasn't quite sure he was willing to go through with, but I think what James Farmer talks about, and he says this in Eyes on the Prize, that it was a strategic bluff on Randolph's part. And I'm not too sure about that. But when Roosevelt capitulated and signed the executive order, any discrimination in the workplace, but not desegregating the armed services, I think that on the one hand, we can see that as a victory for Black workers, but some of Randolph's contemporaries took issue with the fact that we didn't get a desegregated armed services. And I think that really informs Randolph's work after the war is over and his push to continue to get Black men and women on equal footing with their white contemporaries in armed services. But after the FEPC was established and Executive Order 8802 was signed, he called the march off. But what was interesting about Randolph's rhetoric and his activism in Chicago is that while nationally the March on Washington branches held off on sending people to Washington, D.C., the folks in Chicago continued to organize. And they sent about 200 people to Washington and did a Chicago March on Washington, right? So I think what that tells us is that in the larger, I think, trajectory of Black activism, well, I make the case that Chicago activism was a little bit different because it was a very independent nature of civil rights activism in the city. And this occurred for a variety of reasons: politics, the culture of the city, so forth. Its center as an industrial hub, a center of CIO activism, Black radical activism that took place in the city. But I think that Randolph really galvanized that spirit of workers and activists in Chicago, and it encouraged them to go out and do such things. And so I think that's an important part of his rhetoric, and I think this is kind of the string that pulls all of our talks together, because I know Brother Johnson is going to talk a lot about rhetorical strategies that go in there. And I don't want to belabor this point because I wanted my brothers to talk too, but I think I just want to put that out there, that A. Phillip A. Phillip Randolph is this catalyst for the Black freedom struggle that we don't talk enough about. And I think maybe we can come back in the question and answer part and part of the conversation and talk more about where he fits and really what he means for our struggle and Black resistance. I wrote all of this stuff, didn't read any of it. Like, I don't know why. Yeah, it's your turn.
You up, Doc. So when Brother Kimball reached out to me to do this panel, I'm not a labor historian. I write primarily on popular culture and Black masculinity, but I will say, can you hear me now? Okay, I write primarily on popular culture and Black masculinity, but I will say that when I was offered the opportunity to join the dorm alumni chapter of Phi Beta Sigma, one of the things that drew me to the organization were the litany of men who had gone through the organization before I did. Elaine Locke,
Yeah.
of course, James Weldon Johnson. We all had to learn again, lift every voice and sing. Huey P. Newton, and of course, A. Phillip Randolph. And I felt a particular charge as a Black professor to double down on this particular tradition of the fraternity, because many of the younger members go through the fraternity and don't actually have a relationship with those figures.
Mm-hmm.
So this offered me an opportunity to think at large about A. Phillip Randolph. And I decided to do so through the guise of a 1964 film, Michael Romer's Nothing But a Man. One of the most important images of Black masculinity in the 20th century came courtesy of Michael Romer's film, Nothing But a Man. Set in Alabama, but filmed on location primarily in Atlantic City, New Jersey, throughout 1963. The film was completed a month after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Nothing But a Man, with its focus on Black masculinity and fatherhood in relationship to work and organized labor, serves in part as a tribute to Asa Phillip Randolph, co-founder of The Messenger, and who is most well known as the organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. During freedom rides and civil rights marches of the early 1960s, in which media coverage often depicted Black men as loose cannons with little respect for the law, however unjust, Nothing But a Man offered a rarely seen and perhaps unprecedented portrait of Black men. As such, the director, Michael Romer, used NAACP poll workers to help do research for the film, adding a level of authenticity to the narrative. At the center of the film was Duff Anderson, portrayed with brooding nuance by Ivan Dixon, whose gestures, facial and physical, conveyed the complexity of Black manhood that had usually not been presented in television and film, where it was usually presented as cartoonish and threatening. Duff Anderson was neither Stephen Fetchit, the bumbling and shuffling character that actor Lincoln Perry made a crossover star in the 1930s, or Malcolm X, an icon of Black militancy for generations. Duff Anderson was, as the film suggests, just a man. Working with an all-Black unionized section gang, so-called Gandy dancers, who helped maintain railroad tracks throughout the South, Duff meets and falls in love with the preacher's daughter, Josie, who is portrayed by noted jazz vocalist Abbey Lincoln. Yet Duff carries many of the demons that burn in Black men throughout the early 20th century. He left a 4-year-old son in Birmingham with a woman that he didn't marry. He's estranged from his own father, and though working the railroad afforded him freedom and money in comparison to most working class Black men, the work isolated him from community and family. At every turn, as Duff considers marrying Josie, raising his estranged son, and starting a family with her, it is the question of work-life balance, far different from most whites, in which life is not just a metaphor for the quality of life, but for life itself. Duff, for example, after marrying Josie and having to leave his unionized railroad job, takes a job at a local sawmill. When Duff suddenly tries to organize the Black men at the mill to quote unquote stand up for themselves, he is summarily fired and subsequently blacklisted from jobs at other mills. Now, if you want to work like a real nigger, a local bartender tells Duff, you can always go out and chop cotton. Faced with the only job opportunities that he saw as both demanding and backward, as he says, they've done this too long in my family, Duff chooses flight. Duff Anderson is an echo of the men that A. Phillip Randolph first organized as elevator operators and later as sleeping car porters, where trade unions offered Black men some modicum of financial security, a level of social respect among Negroes, and a finer sense of their masculinity. In an era when manhood was largely tethered to your ability to have stable employment. Yet, in The Bartender's Question, one can hear Eugene Debs's appeal to Negro workers, cautioning Black workers to not be, quote, willing to be menials and servants and slaves to the white people. It was an appeal that Randolph took seriously in the formation of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the use of the term brotherhood, perhaps a nod to the African blood brotherhood of Cyril Briggs, which was also influential on the ideas of the young A. Phillip Randolph after he moved to Harlem in 1911. Indeed, brotherhood, scholarship, service, the mantra of the brothers of Phi Beta Sigma will remain a guiding principle of A. Phillip Randolph for the rest of his life and career. Randolph's migration from Jacksonville, Florida to the emerging Black Mecca of Harlem would be the stimulus for what historian Cornelius Bynum describes as a process of reinvention for Randolph, notably in his transition from being simply known as Asa to becoming A. Phillip, which carried an aura of a cosmopolitanism that would be in the spirit of the New Negro movement. Randolph's Harlem homecoming was not unlike that of many Negroes who were being reinvented to all that paid attention as New Negroes. That so many came home to Harlem or Chicago under the guise of opportunity serves as a useful metaphor for a reimagining of Blackness, manhood, and politics. These were processes of transformation that were befitting the so-called Jazz Age, where the spirit of modernist creativity, social and artistic improvisation, and the collaborative ethos of the big bands of James Reese Europe, Fletcher Henderson, and Duke Ellington, in the context in which many would claim this as their entry point into a world made anew. Among them would be Randolph, who finds his initial footing in Ye Friends of Shakespeare, the Harlem Shakespeare Society, where his sense of performativity, which would later have an outlet in his oratory, would align with his sense of an emerging radicalism, social consciousness, and talent for organizing. In Shakespearean drama, Randolph found one of his defining mantras: above all, to thine own self be true, then thou canst be false to no man. Culture for service, service for humanity. The brothers of Phi Beta Sigma are often reminded, and it was a phrase that Randolph began to embody even in the earliest years of the fraternity. Randolph finds his political voice in The Messenger, the journal that he would launch with fellow socialist traveler Chandler Owens. The pages of The Messenger were a site of spirited debate with other journals like Cyril Briggs's Crusader, Hubert Harrison's Negro Voice, and most notably Marcus Garvey's Negro World. That such debates often spilled out to the street corners where activists stood on boxes speaks to the palpable spirit of discourse that was in that moment an analog or pre-digital example of what Black Twitter once was. That Randolph and Owens also utilizing community book clubs and study groups as part of a broader effort of what Jarvis R. Givens details in his important book, Fugitive Pedagogy, highlights their commitment to Black study. The New Negro marked a period in which Black men came to public voice, though Randolph and the pages of The Messenger offer a more complex view of gender in that moment. Indeed, one of The Messenger's major patrons was Lucille Campbell Green Randolph, a local Harlem businesswoman and wife of A. Phillip Randolph. Quote, the new Negro woman with her head erect and spirit undaunted, ever conscious of his historic and noble mission of doing her bit toward the liberation of her people in particular and the human race in general, is how The Messenger described Black women in a 1923 issue devoted to the new Negro woman. Though Lucille Campbell Randolph was not a member of Zeta Phi Beta Incorporated, Her marriage and partnership with her husband mirrored the relationship between the sorority and Phi Beta Sigma, which are constitutionally bound. The only.
Come on, man. We heard
Indeed,
you.
when one glances at the rather dour demeanor of Randolph and the many photos taken of him during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, one sees the impression of an elder who was being pushed to the margins of a movement that he helped create, as much as we see a man who lost his life partner only months earlier in April of 1963. It was on the pages of the Messenger that Randolph called into question the idea of the slacker porter, contrasting him with the manly man. As Robert Hawkins writes, through this binary opposition, Randolph constructed an ideal of Black working class manhood founded in dignified work, race pride, and labor solidarity. Like many of his peers, Randolph was not immune to the so-called respectability politics of the era as he sought to rehabilitate the idea of the Black worker through trade unionism. And indeed, these were some of the most pronounced themes of Nothing But a Man, which also links these attributes to an idealized Black fatherhood. Nothing But a Man was also notable for its soundtrack, which featured music exclusively from the Motown Recording Company, which at the time was an up-and-coming Black-owned corporation that had only been incorporated 3 years before the film was shot. It was both prescient on Romer's part and savvy of label owner Berry Gordy to include the quote-unquote sound of young America as part of the film's soundscape. Indeed, Gordy's bet on Black popular music that would cross over to white mainstream audiences would dramatically shift the prospect of many Black musicians well into the future. None of this would have been conceivable to Randolph, who, in erecting language of manhood for Black working class union members, pitted these workers against the, quote, tip-taking working class musician. Ironically, given Randolph's own proximity to the Black performance and the Black creative classes, his stance seemed surprising. But what Randolph was juxtaposing was the image of a hardworking Black man to that of the itinerant bluesman sitting at a train station performing for his meals. As Miriam Thackett argues in her book, Writing Jane Crow, the train platform was a site for which the right of Black people to sell their wares, whether fried chicken sandwiches or blues tunes, were contested. When Randolph, to use Hawkins' words, quote, asked porters to decide whether they were proudly laboring union men, musical mendicants performing on the street for whatever the Pullman company and the traveling public might throw their way, he was contributing to this discourse. Nearly a century after Randolph offered these words, in a historical moment when labor unions continue to be under assault, especially those that are visibly Black, one wonders how Randolph would view the situation of the run-of-the-mill Black musician or rapper or Hollywood writer who sell their wares to transnational corporations but are offered little beyond the status of a contract laborer. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon again, everybody. My name is, again, Omar Eaton Martinez. I dabble in museums and public historic sites and memorialization and trying to intersect all those things with justice and community engagement. And so what I've been tasked to do is to, it's not an exhaustive list, but to give you a little bit of a taste of how we have been able to capture the legacy of our good brother, A. Phillip Randolph. And I can't tell you how overjoyed I am to be on the stage with my frat. This is incredible. So I'm so glad
Go mob.
here right now. No. So I want to talk a little bit about like really the importance of statues. You know, we've heard all these things with the Confederate statue and whatnot, but when it comes to memorializing the Black experience, you know, we have a different lens. And it's really important that we understand that it's our duty not only to the descendants of those who have endured this intense and immense suffering that contributed significantly to the fabric of our society, but also to ourselves as we strive for a more inclusive and just future. We look to these statues and to these art pieces, whether they're performance or their paintings or what have you, in a way to be encouraged and to be reinvigorated to continue the fight the justice that we fight for justice that we justly deserve. So, we know that these statues and monuments have always played a significant role in preserving and celebrating our history, culture, and values. They serve as potent symbols of our shared heritage, as well as a reminder of the lessons we've learned from our past. Yet for a long time, Black people and their remarkable contributions to American history have been neglected in that regard. But by memorializing African descendants with statues and other forms of memorials, we are acknowledging the undeniable contributions they have made for our nations. For our ancestors who were captured and endured the treacherous journey of the Middle Passage, to the courageous leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, to the movement leaders and culture keepers of today. Black people have played an integral role in shaping the America we know today and the world. Their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity, and they inspire us all to strive for a more equitable and just society. Moreover, statues and monuments serve as educational tools, especially when they're done in proper context. They provide a platform for learning and discussion, allowing us to engage with our history, warts and all, right? So you have these statues, these monuments, these paintings, these performances, literary pieces. They give us a Socratic moment to really engage with our history and our culture. And so the act of memorialization sends a powerful message to future generations. It says that we are committed to a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable society that encourages young minds to aspire to greatness, regardless of their background, and reinforces the idea that any more, regardless of their race or ethnicity, can make a lasting impact on our nation. And so, we can't overstate the importance of doing this work, especially when it comes to Asa Phillip Randolph, and my two brothers have already laid out the history for you here. He has an incredible legacy, but we all know it's understated when it comes to the pantheon of iconic civil rights leaders. And we are hopefully here to course correct that so that we can really have the proper context of the full legacy of activism during that time. As we erect these monuments and celebrate the achievements of African Americans, we take a crucial step toward a more unified and enlightened society. So we should embrace this opportunity and ensure that our history reflects the full spectrum of our shared American experience. If you look at this first slide, that picture of Brother Randolph was done by the one and only Gordon Parks, right? So there's an intersection here. We get to lift up the legacy of the man in the pictures and in the statues and other forms of memorialization, but also the people who memorialize them, we need to honor them as well, as we know the great legacy of Gordon Parks. Next slide. And that was done in 1942. So here we have the statue or the monument really in the Union Station in Washington, D.C. Has anybody ever seen this? It's a beautiful statue. I have not. I would argue it's not in the best position in the station. It could be better. The politics of space is real, right? And we have to remember that. But this was done by an African American sculptor, Ed Dwight, and was commissioned. Member of Phi Beta Sigma. I did not know that. I did not know that. That's awesome. So he did this under the commission of the AFL-CIO, which is important to note. And obviously is honoring his great legacy as the Black labor and civil rights leader and the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. But also what it says at the bottom, which you may not be able to see, it says, this is a quote from Brother Randolph. It says, at the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization, right? So when I think about his legacy, I think about his connection to our fraternity. I think about the reasons why I chose Sigma. These are the reasons, right? Organization, culture for service, service for humanity, understanding our tenets of brotherhood, scholarship, and service. All these things are really important to us. And just a little bit about Ed Dwight, now that I know he's frat, He was a graduate engineer, and he was the first African-American astronaut candidate, right? So that's
Wow.
nothing to be understated. He's dedicated his career to doing these types of pieces. He has a series of bronzes depicting the contributions of Blacks to the American frontier West. And he also has about a series of 50 bronzes that was exhibited over there in the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Park. So he's done a lot of work for the National Park Service. But in that work, he was actually encouraged to bring another bronze series celebrating the roots of jazz. And so he has a great piece with Miles Davis. If you look it up, it's a beautiful bronze sculpture he did for that series called Jazz and American Art Form. And now he has over 70 bronzes characterizing the creation and evolution of jazz from its African and European roots to the fusion of contemporary music. He's done, again, with the National Park Service. If anybody ever been to the Frederick Douglass site, he did that statue of Frederick Douglass as well. So he's created over 18,000 gallery sculptures and is represented in many galleries throughout the country. He even was commissioned in 2009 to do bronze work of Michelle and Barack Obama that I believe are still on tour to this day. So he has done incredible work. And so it's just good to understand the connections of the people who create the memorialization as well as the people that we are memorializing. Next slide. So this is another bronze done by an African-American woman sculptor, Tina Allen. So those who follow sculpture should know both these names very well. Tina Allen unfortunately left us too soon. She died back in 2008 at the young age of 58. But this work was her first major work. It's over there in Boston and Back Bay. Anybody from Boston have been over there? If you haven't, please go over there and check it out. It's a beautiful piece. And this obviously was done in connection to his work and his legacy with the sleeping car porters. Tina Allen herself was known for doing these bronze pieces of African-American folks and notable people. Her father was a jazz drummer and she's Grenada born. So she has a West Indian lens to her work as well. She describes her art as history in bronze because she always focused on important Black historical figures and wanted to portray them through sculpture. Allen often focused on the Harlem Renaissance, and she also had periods of her work focused specifically on Black men, and then she turned her interest to Black women. She has done a lot of different things, including a great piece, and I meant to put it on the slide, but it's a beautiful statue of George Washington Carver, another notable member of Phi Beta Sigma, that is in the George Washington Carver Garden at the Missouri Botanical Gardens in St. Louis. So it's a 12-foot piece. She's done it, well, actually that's more of a life-size piece. She did a 12-foot piece also of Sojourner Truth, honoring the suffragist movement over there in Memorial Park, Battle Creek in Michigan. So she's done a tremendous amount of work. And as you can see on the bottom, maybe you can see it on the bottom image, she actually signs her name on his shoe. And she's, again, one of the sculptors we try to honor more and more. I do work with one of our sites in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. It's a site of Daniel Chester French. So it's the historic artist home and studio where he did his work. And Daniel Chester French is the designer of the Lincoln Memorial. And so what we try to do there is we try to be inclusive and expansive in telling the full American story. And we want to work more in bringing these legacies of Black sculptors and other sculptors who are on the margins, like Tina Allen and Ed Dwight. Next slide. So this is the National Asa Phillip Randolph Home and Porter Museum in Chicago. How many people even know this existed? That's good. That's more than that. I mean, it is an understated place, but it's a powerful place, and I really hope you all go to see and visit it. Dr. Lynn Hughes was the founder, and it's also led by her protege, David Peterson. It was founded back in 1995 in South Side Chicago. It talks about the legacy of Randolph and the Porters. And right now it is currently focused on Black labor history, being the only Black labor history museum in the nation. It's preparing for a $30 million expansion right now for those fundraisers out there. But they also are looking to create a Black labor district in the South Side of Chicago, honoring Asa Phillip Randolph's memory and legacy. So as you can see up there in the big picture on the bottom, I'm there with Dr. Hughes over my right shoulder and David Peterson over my left. On the top, you can see the images from the grounds, which feature art pieces that honor the legacy of Brother Randolph. There's also paintings inside of the museum. And then you see the actual images of the building over there in the South Side. And they do have a working relationship with the historic Pullman District that's been designated as a national monument under the National Park Service. And it has now recently, December 29th of 2022, the legislation signed by the President Biden included a provision that changed the designation of Pullman National Monument to now Pullman National Historical Park. So the historic Pullman community was designated as a national monument by President Obama in 2015. And so this is a big deal that we're honoring this site in this way. And I hope we can continue to honor Brother Randolph and that museum. They're really focused on taking sort of his socialist strand and making sure that they're there for the community. The expansion is really community focused, and they've been freedom fighters in that neighborhood for a long time. I know they've worked with local chapters, graduate chapters of Sigma. I know Brother Dr. Kimball has been involved with them and have been in talks with them as well. Next slide. That's the Pullman Porter site that's under the National Park Service. Next slide. So these are commissioned portraits that exist at the National Portrait Gallery. These are important pieces that have been done. The one on the left is done by Ernest Hamlin Baker. It is a white artist. It was done in 1945. In 1978, or between 1945 and 1978, Time Magazine acquired that portrait, and then Time Magazine in 1978 gave about 800 works of original cover art to the National Portrait Gallery, which included this piece. And the museum is definitely dedicated to the stories of individuals who shaped the country. And the Time collection features prominent international figures and events, which always enrich our understanding of the United States in its global context. And then if you look at the other picture on the left, that was given by the Harmon Foundation, a philanthropic organization based in New York. This was part of an exhibition called The Portraits of Outstanding Americans of Negro Origin, which opened at the Smithsonian in 1944. So this is right at his height, after 1941 and the notoriety that he received through his activism. And this particular exhibition documented noteworthy African-Americans' contributions to the United States, modeling their goal of social equality. The Harmon sought portraits from African-American artist Laura Wheeler Waring and Euro-American artist Betsy Graves Raynaud. And the two painters followed the conventional codes of academic portraiture, seeking to convey their sitters' extraordinary accomplishments in this painting, along with a variety of educational materials, toured nationwide for 10 years, serving as a visual rebuttal to racism. And so this is the power of these visual representations that honor the legacy that people throw up. And this is actually done in the spirit of justice and honoring and lifting up Black folks. Unfortunately, we have people who've done the same thing to do the exact opposite. And that's why we have all of this controversies although it's not very controversial for me in terms of the Civil War monuments that had to come down. Because people did that to also evoke a certain narrative that was based on a false narrative, a lost cause narrative, that really evoked white supremacy in the absolute worst way. And I think that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Blue 5. All right. And again, good afternoon. I am Andre Johnson. I want to, before I do my presentation, just shout out any other members of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated. If you in the house, hey, all right, there you go, Blue 5, all right. And we cannot forget the finer women of our constitutionally bound sisters of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated. Come on in this house. So glad to have all of you here. And we would definitely have some time for some Q&A. So I will just go ahead on and just present because I think we will have some time to discuss a little bit further. I want to talk about I have compassion upon the multitude, the prophetic rhetoric of A. Phillip Randolph, and the meaning of Jesus. That's the title that I'm working on. Thank you, Brother Kimball, for giving me another writing assignment that I'm gonna have to work on and hopefully get published, because I really got into this, and I won't be able to, of course, present the entirety on today, but I do want to.
The preacher laugh.
I want to just give a little snapshots. That's all, a little snapshot. I know where I am. I'm just going to govern myself accordingly. All right. In the October 1919 issue of The Messenger, the magazine that A. Phillip Randolph and Chandler Owen founded 2 years earlier, Randolph penned an editorial titled, "The Failure of the Negro Church." He began with, yes, the Negro Church has failed. It has failed in a great crisis. Its failure is patent and apparent. For Randolph, the reason for the church failure was economic. The church, for him, had been converted into a business, 1919. Only concerned with profits, thereby focus upon debits and credits, deficits and surpluses. This business model of church had also affected Black churches as well, especially those of the Episcopal, Congregational, Presbyterian, and Methodist Episcopal traditions. He argued that these churches' policies were, quote, molded by and handed down from the white ecclesiastical oligarchy. This ecclesiastical oligarchy, in turn, is controlled by the, quote, money power of the country. For Randolph, the Black church has also failed because it has not educated the people. Ministers are leading Negroes, Randolph argued, who are below in intelligence to the lowest member of their church. He continued, the Negro ministry is ignorant of the modern problems of capital and labor. It is disinterested in unionism as a means for securing wages, shorter hours, higher wages, shorter hours, and better working conditions for Negro workers. It regards the discussion of politics in the church as sacrilegious unless some good old Abraham Lincoln Republican desires the vote of the Negro and is willing to pay for educational propaganda. It has failed to use its power to rouse the Negro against disenfranchisement and lynching. Randolph called for the two things to address the problem with the Black church in 1919. First, he called for, I got some music going on. Is that, I was waiting on the organ. Where's the Hammond? Put me in C sharp. Randolph was called. Now, see, y'all ain't no good. Y'all are no, man, I ain't coming back here. Randolph called for two things to address the problem with the Black church. First, he called for an educated ministry.
He argued that the Black church must get the education of information instead of the education of inspiration. It needs less Bible and more economics, history, sociology, and physical science. Second, Randolph argued that the church must be put to different uses. For him, the church, quote, must become an open educational forum where problems of hygiene, labor, government, racial relationships, national and international questions are discussed by specialists. Churches might also be used as places for the beginning of cooperative stores that would enable the Negro workman to reduce the high cost of living. And he closed the editorial by stating this, quote, the new Negro demands a new ministry, an educated, fearless, and radical ministry. The new Negro demands a new church, a church that is the center of his social, economic, and political hopes and strivings. The church must become something more than a temple of prayer to the people who are lynched, disenfranchised, and Jim Crowed. Prayer has been tried for over 50 years. In short, the church must set its face against a philosophy of profits to a philosophy of service. Wow. Oh, yeah. According to historian Cynthia Teller, the editorial is often cited as evidence of Randolph's anti-church and agnostic, at least, or even atheist position. For instance, author Edwin Embray, I think it was around 1944, suggested that Randolph was a doubter of Christianity and one who stood against all religion. He maintained that Randolph only used religion and religious imagery in his rhetoric only as a way to influence his followers in his labor and civil rights activism. Embry wrote, quote, while uncompromising in his public stand and honest almost to a point of fanaticism, Randolph was not above appealing to the porters in their own terms. Though he was an atheist, he knew that many of the Negro workers came from deeply religious homes. So in his speeches and in the Brotherhood paper, The Black Worker, he fell back on the biblical language and imagery he had learned from his father. He spread at the top of his bulletins the Bible text, ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. He pointed out that the church should support labor, quote, since Jesus Christ was a carpenter. He was called, quote, a Moses leading the people from the land of bondage into the promised land. Now, while many have followed this line of thinking and doing research on A. Phillip Randolph, in her biography of him, Cynthia Taylor challenges this perception of the labor leader. She argues that Randolph's, quote, religiosity covered a wide spectrum of liberal Protestant beliefs, from religious humanism on the left to orthodox theological positions on the right. She positions Randolph not as a deeply religious man, but as one with more nuance, a more nuanced view of his connections to theology. Now, according to Taylor, Randolph said nothing affected him as deeply as his relationship with the AME church. He and his brother grew up under it, grew up in it, and our father was a part of it, and our mother was quite religious. What he learned from his parents and the church he attended was, quote, a sense of dignity and pride in oneself and one's race, the necessity of fighting and demanding civil rights as being integral to possessing human dignity, not just independently, but also collectively and as a community, and love and admiration for the learning of education. It was these values that provided the foundation for Randolph's lifelong commitment to fighting racial justice, fighting racial prejudice, and conditioned him for a life of service to others. So the question I wrestled with when I was given this assignment, how does a misunderstanding of Randolph's religiosity happen? In the Q&A, somebody might want to ask me about his relationship with Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, he and his father and the relationship with Bishop Turner. Very interesting story. Don't have time to go into it right now. But how did this happen? Well, there may be several answers, but I would surmise that much of the confusion is rooted in a misunderstanding of Black religious expression broadly and the African-American prophetic tradition in particular. I define prophetic rhetoric as discourse grounded in the sacred, rooted in a community experience that offers a critique of existing communities and traditions by charging and challenging society to live up to ideals they espouse while offering celebration, encouragement, and hope for a brighter future. It is a rhetoric categorized by a steadfast refusal to adopt itself to the perspectives of its audience, and a rhetoric that dedicates itself to the rights of individuals. Located in the margins of the society, it intends to lift the people to an ethical conception of whatever the people deem as sacred by adopting at times a controversial style of speaking. Woe unto you. Moreover, the rights of the individuals that prophetic rhetoric dedicates itself to is especially that of the poor, marginalized, and exploited members of society. It intends to lift the people to an ethical conception of the deity. Now, this definition also explicates a four-part rhetorical structure. Real quick, first, the text must ground itself, or the speech or whatever, it grounds itself in the sacred. There's an element, second, of conscious raising through a sharing or an announcement of what's really happening, naming the demon, as I call it if I was in class. Third is the charge, the challenge, the critique, the judgment, or the warning. And then, of course, the last is the encouragement and hope. Now, traditionally, many people studying prophetic rhetoric focus on two primary traditions. The first one is apocalyptic prophecy. If you don't know what it is, this is what it is. It is, oh, God is coming back, or somebody's gonna come and get you if you don't act right and move, and nothing you can do about it. That's it. That's all you need to know. Secondly, however, for the purposes of this presentation, I want to focus on the Jeremiad. The Jeremiad became a part of the American rhetorical tradition around the 17th century, around the New England Puritans, as a way to express their self-identity as, quote, chosen people. Believing that they had a divine plan to free corrupt European religious and social establishment, the Puritans, as many will call them later, felt a need to establish a, quote, holy society in the wilderness of America. Drawing from the biblical story of Exodus, the Puritans saw themselves as the new Israel, leaving the bondage of Europe to come into a new world they believed to be the promised land. They felt sure of themselves because in being the new Israel, the Puritans believed themselves to be the chosen ones, whom God has called and ordained to be an instrument of God's will. With the chosen people leading the way, America became the proverbial city on the hill whose light shone for all of us to see. Hallelujah, glory to God. But unlike prophetic rhetoric of the Jeremiad, the African-American prophetic tradition does not have its origins in freedom. Birth from slavery, shaped in Jim and Jane Crow America. The African-American version of the prophetic tradition has been the primary vehicle that has comforted and given voice to many African-Americans. Through struggle and sacrifice, this tradition has expressed Black people's call for unity and cooperation, as well as the community's anger and frustrations. It has been both hopeful and pessimistic. It has celebrated the beauty and myth of American exceptionalism and its special place in the world, while at the same time damning it to hell for not living up to the promises and ideals America espouses. It's a tradition that celebrates both the creator's or the divine's hand in history, offering hallelujahs for deliverance from slavery and Jim and Jane Crow, while at the same time asking, where in the hell is God during the tough and trying times? It is a tradition that develops a theological outlook quite different at times from orthodoxy, one that finds God very close, but yet so damn far away. For many African Americans, the Jeremiad proposed that was a huge problem anyway. Inherent in the Jeremiad is that its proponents never questioned the foundation of its belief, or in prophetic terms, it never questioned the sacred. People primarily using their Jeremiah never once questioned their belief that America was the promise, America was the land of promise and destiny. They never questioned that belief that they were the new Israel or chosen people. Whenever calamity happened, the Puritans may have believed that it was because somebody sinned, but that sin was only a corrective to get us back in line. Nothing that's going to take away our chosenness. Once the people start living up to what the people held as sacred, the calamity would cease, God would heal the land. However, for many African Americans did not have confidence or think that the covenant would even work for them. If African Americans adopted a prophetic persona to appeal to their audiences, they had to find other means. So in this presentation, I argue that A. Phillip Randolph used prophetic rhetoric grounded in the African-American prophetic tradition to engage his audiences. I demonstrate this by highlighting only a piece, just the first part of that definition grounded in the sacred, because he begins, especially during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, during the, quote, civil rights era, really begins to re-examine what it means when we talk about sacred and sacredness. And I just want to highlight, instead of going into all of the realms of the sacred, I just want to highlight the rhetoric around the personhood of Jesus. It's here that I argue that Randolph not only adopts this prophetic persona within the Black rhetorical and prophetic tradition, not only to build a social movement, but to do so, he draws heavily from his Black church experience right here in Jacksonville. In his speech commemorating the Diamond Jubilee of the Bermuda African Methodist Episcopal Conference, Randolph frames Jesus as the leader of a band of Christians in Judea in the first century to become the Messiah of mankind under the banner of the one and true living God. Randolph continued this framing of Jesus in the speech on March on Washington. He did give a speech that day too on August 28, 1963. He told the audience that day, and we have taken our struggle into the streets as the labor movement took its struggle into the streets, as Jesus Christ led the multitudes through the streets of Judea. The plain and simple fact is that until we went into the streets, the federal government was indifferent to our demands. It was not until the streets and jails of Birmingham were filled that Congress began to think about civil rights legislation. However, a fuller understanding of Randolph's Jesus would come in his address at Pilgrim Baptist Church. Randolph begins his address by grounded in the sacred words of Jesus himself by speaking when he spoke to his disciples. I have compassion upon the multitude because they continue with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I will not send them away fasting, for they may fall by the wayside, for divers may come from afar. Situating Jesus's words at the beginning of his speech or sermon helps him to frame the rest of this sermon. He wanted his audience to know that Jesus Christ in his earthly form, and that's going to be important later, was concerned about the poor, the forgotten man, the worker, the disinherited, the properless, and the oppressed, unquote. Further quoting Jesus, he said, when the lowly Nazarene said, come unto me, all you who heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. I am meek and lowly at heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And followed this declaration with the admonition to his disciples, again, I say unto you, it is easier for a camel to go in the eye of the needle than a rich man to get into the kingdom of God. He expressed the central doctrine of what he was beginning to call a Christian revolution. It is here that his audience begins to see the prophetic unction of reshaping and refashioning the sacred Jesus from the embedded theological positions of his day. Randolph does two things here to reshape Jesus, and I'm through. First, by highlighting the personhood and humanness of Jesus, the lowly Nazarene, Randolph invites his audience to see Jesus on their level. What did Jesus do in the body while he walked on earth? This is different from the Jesus that is high and lifted up, the Jesus that most believers will see as the authentic Jesus. Randolph Jesus is personable and relatable. Randolph Jesus has dusty feet and need water and need to go to the bathroom and gets hungry every now and then. And yes, even gets upset and frustrated. Somebody say turning over some tables. However, it's the second part of the opening that shifts his presentation by quoting Jesus' words to his disciples, and after telling about the parable of the young rich ruler who wanted to inherit eternal life, Randolph sees Jesus as a revolutionary, which for him, when taken seriously, leads to what he called the Christian Revolution. According to Randolph, it was the first time since the days of old Hebrew prophets that a religious or government leader expressed the concept of egalitarian status of the ancient lowly and common laborers, the camel drivers, the publicans, the sinners, with the high priests of the scribes and Pharisees, Sadducees, conquering warriors, philosophers, and kings. This rhetorical move not only highlights the earthly Jesus, but also connects him with the 8th century BCE prophets in the Hebrew Bible. Randolph centers Jesus' prophetic rhetoric when he tells his audience or told his audience that Jesus made it unmistakably clear where he stood with the respect to the how of the haves and have-nots. When he cried out, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You devour widow houses and for the pretense make long prayer. Therefore you shall receive a greater damnation." He continued, and when Jesus came to his hometown where he was brought up, he went into the synagogue, stood up and read, and there he delivered unto him a book from the prophet Isaiah. And when he opened the book, he found in the pages, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised." Now, Randolph's construction of Jesus is complete. By highlighting Luke 4:18 and 19, which many scholars call Jesus's manifesto, Randolph places Jesus with those who are on the margins of society, the people many would like to forget. And since for Randolph, this was the Christian Revolution well nigh 2,000 years ago, this is the mission of the Civil Rights Revolution today. Not only is the Civil Rights Revolution through sit-in, wade-ins, lie-down marches, boycotts, picket lines, shaking America, if not the world, into consciousness of Black America's will to win freedom, racial and social justice, and human dignity, but it is awakening and arousing the white workers, white liberals, leaders of the Church of Protestant, Catholics, and Jewish faith, and the white poor to the magnitude and importance of the problem of poverty to Negroes and white Americans alike. In short, the gospel is being preached through the civil rights movement, he will argue. The gospel is manifested in the civil rights movement. In our forthcoming work with Amanda Neal Egger with the University of Press of Mississippi, and they are here, go see Emily downstairs, she's great. The summer of 2020, George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. We interviewed several activists of the BLM movement. One of the areas we wanted to know was about the role of faith in the movement. One of our interviewees, we call her Bright Eyes, not her real name, saw her relationship with Jesus as foundational to a role in Black Lives Matter. "I keep going back to Christ," she asserts. Then she continued, "The church has to teach that if there is to be salvation for you, then your salvation is tied to how you embrace the stranger, how you embrace someone you think is the other. The church cannot be silent. The church has a role to play in where we're going in the future. We can't preach on Sunday and sit in our homes and do nothing Monday through Saturday. It can't be like that anymore, because the Black church has always been instrumental in the growth of the Black society from the civil rights movement." But then she says, "But they have lost their way." Bright Eyes' participation in the Black church and BLM highlighted something else for us, as we discovered in our previous work. While participants did not believe that the Black church was in full participant in the BLM movement or not to that level that would have satisfied them, many agreed that the faith they had learned in the church was one of the primary reasons of their involvement with BLM. It was in the church that had lost its way that some participants still found a way to join the movement and grounded it in their faith experience. Now, while scholars note that early in his messenger days, Randolph chastised churches and religious leaders, biographer Cornelius Bynum writes that, quote, the church and the liberation gospel that shaped its very founding helped to guide Randolph's subsequent ideas about social justice that blended egalitarian messages about racial self-worth and industrial reform and shaped core elements of his subsequent civil rights and labor activism. Just like Bright Eyes in our focus group on BLM, Randolph discerned enough from the church of his youth to appreciate what he could and critique what he should. He found that by adopting a prophetic persona to liberate Jesus from the embedded theological framework of his day, he could not only speak to be heard, but potentially move the crowd, but also in the process, finding the joy of his own salvation by speaking truth to power and letting the chips fall where they may. Thank you.